Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Okay. Today we will have the last of the theoretical lectures concerning environmental impact assessment. And in particular, today we will discuss and introduce decision theory and decision support systems, DSS, that are tools that are fundamentals or very useful in carrying out environmental impact assessment procedures. So let's start by asking ourselves some of the basic questions concerning decision theory. First of all, we shall ask ourselves what it means to decide. To decide means choosing between different options, which is the typical condition in which environmental impact assessors are faced or are requested to choose between different options. If a specific case, for example, in environmental impact assessment or strategic environmental appraisal, deciding means evaluating different options. So, in particular, having identified and measured all the criteria of sustainability, what then do I do? So, if the scope is that of being sustainable or environmental friendly, what shall I do? So, the idea is that of comparing with the status quo or other option of the plan and decide which scenario is the best. So when I introduce the word scenario, you shall understand that I have in mind models providing forecasts of possible future situations or so-called scenarios. So decision support tools are models essentially. For example, let's start going to the details of what it means deciding. We have, for example, two different kinds of decision: moral decision and non-moral decision. Moral decision call in the whole complex, in the whole game, the complex systems of feelings and personal tastes and political positions or philosophical or whatever. For example, get married is an example of a moral decision, while non-moral decision, that is the ambit of environmental impact assessment, are decisions that follow a logical and exogenous target. For example, to buy a car is a non-moral decision that is driven by exogenous drivers. There is another classification of the ambit of decision between private decision and public decision. Private decision involve personal interest, for example, buying share, buying a house, or investing money and so on. And public decision instead involve the interest of the community, for example, building a new road or preserving a lake or preserving an ecosystem and so on. These are public decisions because are the interest of the public. And as we have said several times up to now, we see that in environmental impact assessment, the public is one of the important subjects involved in the procedure. So we are left with the problem of defining the decision problem. For example, we have a question, we have several alternative answers to the questions, and we must choose or decide what is the right answer. So stated, it seems like very simple and straightforward. In reality, as it's always the case in environmental issues, the decision is not so simple and straightforward. Instead, it may become quite complicated. For example, let's give you a practical example. I have to go from city A to city B. We may have three alternatives. We may go by car, we may go by train or by bus, but we choose to go by train. You may question why we did choose to go by train. Up to now, the choice has not been justified, and if it has not been justified, how can I verify that is the right choice? I do not have arguments for justifying the choice and for sustaining my position, so the choice up to now it is quite weak. Let's see how we can make it a little bit more robust, this choice. A useful caveat: we do not have to guess the right choice, as in reality it is assumed that it is not known a priori what is the best choice, nor that this knowledge is the exclusive monopoly of any person. So the right choice concerning public decision, like is in environmental issues, is not monopoly of any person, and it is not known a priori, but instead we need tools for choosing and evaluating the best choice. More precisely, we have a goal, we have a series of possible alternatives that are equally viable in principle. We operate a choice based on a criterion of choice. Therefore, in our example, we will say that we choose to go by train, that is my choice, because it is the cheapest way, and this is justification. So I have a choice and I justify my choice. From a technical viewpoint, we can say that we have applied an optimization with a function of cost minimization. So we have minimized the cost of our operation by a function of cost minimizations. So this is a typical problem in decision theory that we are trying to little by little make more formal as possible. An alternative approach to our example, we operate a choice that is maybe based on several selection criteria. For example, instead of only employing cost, we may be more sophisticated and may include cost, speed, and transport, and cost, speed of transport, and comfort. And let's look at the different alternatives. The train is fast, economical, and convenient. The car is not economical, is very fast and comfortable. The bus is cheaper than the car, but less than the train, and is a bit awkward and slower. This is why we choose the train. So you understand that here we are making more and more, we are elaborating more and more details on how we made our choice. In particular, from a formal point of view, we may say that we made a choice with a multiple criteria, or a so-called multi-criteria choice, where we have optimized the cost, minimizing the cost, the speed, maximizing the speed, and the comfort, maximizing the comfort. We have a goal to achieve, we have several alternatives and possible solutions. We have a criterion, or maybe many criteria for choosing. We have different ways of measuring and description of the criteria, type or types of these criteria. We have rules of choice, minimize, maximize, optimize, or others. We get an order of the alternatives: train, car, bus. So the final result of my decision problem is that of getting a ranking of the different possible alternatives or solution to my problem. As this is in general the output of a multi-criteria analysis, the output is that of producing a ranking of alternatives. Then I shall propose you an interesting doubt. The cost, for example, has been optimized with a function of minimization. The speed has been optimized with a function of maximization. But for example, what about comfort? The problem arises from the fact that the first two criteria are directly measurable and quantifiable. The third may just be estimated and merely subjectively and only in a rough or qualitative way. Qualitative estimations may be used frequently, and in particular in assessment of environmental sustainability, we are always in this condition. We have always some criteria that have to be or may be evaluated only in a qualitative way and not quantitative. This is why we need precise standards and approved procedures. We need for rules, there is a need for rules for scientific rigor and for justify our actions. But we need also models for applying these rules and for standardizing the procedures. This is how the game is built up. Decision theory, we adopt a detailed rules and standards approved procedures. Decision theory provides us with the tools, and decision theory provides us with the basic assumption needed for building the decision tools. So from the decision theory, we obtain the guidelines for building decision tools. Decision theory guides us in building the models that will help decision makers in ranking and selecting the appropriate scenarios, ranking of alternative based on the possible scenarios produced by our models. This is why we need decision support tools. What are decision support tools? A decision support tool is a model that seeks to provide answers to questions put forward by those involved in decision making. This is the classical definition provided by Boyasu, one of our decision theory. Of course, the decision tools do not replace the decision maker, instead help in to identify and highlighting that or those solution, but better than other meet the initial prerequisites, or if you want, the objectives of the decision. Why we shall use decision support tools? There are several reasons. In particular, these tools allow to justify the choices. So these tools allow us to build a well-structured process ensuring, let's say, rationality, transparency, reproducibility, and participation, if permitted, to the decision. And I shall note that this characteristic, rationality, comes from the decision theory. We want a rational decision. Transparency and reproducibility comes from the need of communicating widely the criteria that guided us in the decision, and participation, as you may recall, is a standard prerequisite in order to involve public in the decisions. But also, decision support tools allows or helps the decision maker to clarify their goals. So it is a tool that may be used iteratively, helps to organize in an organic way the available information, helps in identifying and quantifying the main variables involved, and their mutual relationships allow the analysis of alternative scenarios, coming to a rational ranking of the possible alternatives. As I told you, it is the objective of a multi-criteria analysis. In particular, rationality has to do with the completeness of the data and the structuring of choice. with the objectivity or subjectivity of data and with quality and quantity of data. So in trying to be rational, we shall be complete as much as possible with the data. We shall structure our data in the most structured way, and we will soon give you an example of what we mean by a structured decision. We shall define which are the objective and subjective parts of our data set, and which are the characteristic of a data set in terms of quality and quantity of data. Concerning transparency, which has to do with the documentation, and references that allow us to sustain our decision process, and also has to do with the responsibility of a decision. I had to be transparent if I want to make a responsible decision. Reproducibility has to do with the fact that monitoring and verification of the effects of our decision should be the most as possible, should come to a unique conclusion in order to sustain the decision maker in disputes or discussion or argues. And finally, participation ensures that various interests, even of minor point of view, are included in the decision, and participation is a fundamental aspect in order to make the more acceptable as possible the decision process. How do decision support tools work? There is a similar mechanism for all areas of application. Here we are still introducing decision theory basics. A similar mechanism for all areas of application, a schematic representation of a reality that is formalized in a model, in our language, and then a precise decisional procedure that is generally based on a set of axioms that guide the decision maker in building the ranking of alternatives. What is a model? A model allows to reproduce the essential characteristics of objects and real processes, eliminating those aspects that, for the purpose of our study, constitutes a disturbing element and a misleading complication. So, the model shall help us in identifying those aspects and putting into focus those aspects that are really relevant and important in our decision concerning for example, the sustainability and environmental friendliness of our application. And the model puts in the background all other disturbing elements that may be misleading and confuse the decision maker in coming to its decision. There are essentially four main stages in the decision process. Identifying the problem. For example, I have to go from city A to B and I have three alternatives. Build a modeling description of a problem, introducing, for example, criteria, minimization of cost, maximization of speed, and optimization, if you want, of comfort. Then with this model, we pass to the analytical phase, in which we provide rankings of the possible alternatives based on the models that we have put forward. And finally, assessment, that is the choice, producing a choice between the ranked alternatives. Identification includes the determination of selection criteria. The criteria must be as most as possible measurable in a quantitative or qualitative or mixed way, When I mean quantitative, when I say quantitative, I mean numbers. When I say qualitative, I mean good, bad, smileys or not smileys, and mixed is a mixed up of the two criteria, of the two ways of representing criteria. And then the criteria must also be operational. So for each of them, we must be able to assign a number that allows some kind of mathematical manipulation. The decision problem is therefore said to be structured in a model. No, a problem is said to be structured if it is placed within a precise framework. In principle, the decision will be said structured if it is certain, meaning non-stochastic. We are trying to put into the background the randomness. It is repeatable, meaning that different decisors may come to the same decision. Maybe operational, meaning that we may manipulate our criteria in terms of algebraic or numerical manipulation, and it has a single objective, so a single one criteria or single criteria decision is the prototype to have a structured decision problem. In this case, we can assume a decision to be perfectly rational. So if we may accept that the decision is not random, certain, it is repeatable by different decisions, it is operational, manipulable in mathematical terms, and there's a single objective, in this case, the decision may be said to be perfectly rational. Please note that often, especially in strategic environmental appraisal, but often also in environmental impact assessment, the decision problem is rather than structured. It is not structured because it is uncertain. It is not repeatable. If repeated, may give different outcomes. It is a strategic type, especially strategic environmental appraisal. This has to do with the time steps. Has a multiple objectives and often conflicting objectives. In our case, it is important to understand the difference between operational decisions and strategic decisions. Latter, strategic decision, more commonly happen in the case of strategic environmental appraisals, along with multi-objectives that may not always make matters particularly perfectly clear and predictable, making thus the decision problem not structured. Sorry, 1 minute, and I Okay, I am back. One or more objects of a decision are highlighted that are consistent with the hypothesis or preference of a model and the objectives of a decision maker. So the model is based on the preference relations of a decision maker. Preference of what? Preference of the possible alternatives. So this allows us to sort the option of a choice, whatever it concerns the project as a whole or the priorities of individual impacts. So with the same criteria, we may select different alternatives or possible selections of choices, but as well we may also rank the different the individual impacts of the different environmental sectors. The results then are analyzed in order to produce the ranking, and their interpretation is based on the choice of the decision maker and so the outcome of the procedure of evaluation procedure or of the decision procedure. What are the involved subjects? The analyst, typically you, environmental engineer, is responsible for building and managing the decision model. The analyst has the responsibility of interpreting initial data, outcomes, and of preparation of the final report. And then the second important subject, it is the decision maker, typically policy makers, that takes the final decision, provides judgments of merit for the procedure, and supervises the work of a decision process, and the decision maker has the final responsibility of interpreting the results of the decision. Analyst and decision maker can sometimes be the same person, but in general, these are distinguished subjects. Typically, the analyst is paid by the committant, so by the person, by the subject, but to want to implement a man-made opera with environmental impacts, while the decision maker is refers to, for example, to competent authorities, which finally have to evaluate the final decision and to make the political decision concerning the implementation of a foreseen project. The two subjects should always agree, being the one complementary and necessary to the other. In fact, problems often arise. Reasons for disagreement may be related to the decision model adopted, they do not agree on the model. Reason related to the results of a procedure, they do not agree on the results of a model, so they discuss the ranking essentially. And then there may be personal reasons, typically in case of corruptions. Personal reasons are the fact that one of the policymakers may have some kind of economical interest in the decision, and this may make the decision process not rational. Let's now give some more notes on operation coming from decision theory. All models for estimating, forecasting, and so on are approximation of a reality, which should be clear to you, and of a real behavior of a decision maker or evaluator. The more a model is rational, the more will be easy for users. But the opposite is also true. The more adherent to reality is the model, the greater its complexity, so it is very difficult to manage it. There is a kind of incomparability between significativity and precision that is linked to the degree of complexity of a system. Increasing system complexity reduces our ability to provide meaningfulness judgment up to a threshold beyond which the significativity and accuracy are mutually exclusive, meaning that I increase the significativity and I am forced to decrease the accuracy of my model. Is a kind of principle. This is the principle of incomparability, what was, for example, proposed by Zadev in '73. Decision theory. What is decision theory? A set of laws and analytical techniques of various kinds whose purpose is to provide methods and models to rationalize the decision-making procedure. Of course, you may understand that decision theory is a very wide subject, and we are not going into the many details of this subject. Instead, we shall just sort out those elements of the decision theory that may help the environmental impact decision to build the most as possible structure of decision procedure. You start by modeling of initial data and modeling the preferences of the decision makers. So we have a first level of modeling, but is a description of the environment in terms of initial environmental data, and the second level of modeling, what is related to the behaviors of the various decision makers or policy makers. So you have to include in this second part the subjective perception of all the subjects involved into the decision. We may give a rigorous definition that comes from decision theory of the decision process. We may say that given a set of alternatives, capital A, and a set of consequences, capital C, and the relationships that link alternatives with the consequences, capital R, decision theory allows to explicitate consequences C as a function of alternatives and relationship, and then to make the appropriate choice. So we start from the possible alternatives, we link the alternatives with the consequences by employing relationships. The preferences of the decision maker concern a schematization of the relationships between initial and final data. For example, we may have four main relations of preferences. It's a very general strict preference, A strictly greater than B, and we may also write A strictly preferred to B. Indifference, A equivalent to B, may be written by using a tilde. A weak preference, so A larger or maybe equal to B, or if you want, we have R come preference, so it is A roughly preferred over B, or incompatibility, A and B are simply not comparable. These are the four extreme cases that we may define for the relation of preference. Each decision model is based on one of these relations alone, and some axioms that ensure the rationality of the behavior of the decision maker are also included into the decision process. First of all, and this comes from the decision theory basics, the axiom of transitivity is a fundamental one. We may say that if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, consequently A is greater than C. This provides a full ordering of the possible alternatives of choice. It is based on paired comparisons. So the axiom of transitivity ensures that the ordering that we may come, or the ranking of the alternatives we may come with our decision, is a complete ranking or a full ordering. This property that guarantees the rationality of the behavior of the decision maker does not always hold in reality. It may sometimes appear, as especially in environmental issues, that A is greater than B and B is greater than C, but sometimes A is smaller than C, with a classical way of formalizing a non-transitive or non-structured decision problem that cannot end up with a complete ordering or rankings of alternative. For this reason, the models are distinguished into prescriptive model, in which the preferences of the decision maker are assumed to be transitive, so complete ordering, relatively simple and rational, represent an ideal model and a simplified reality, often provide full sort of alternatives, so complete ordering or a complete ranking of alternatives, or we may use descriptive models in which preferences are not necessarily transitive. In this case, these models are generally very complex, but you might resort to best approximation of the actual behavior of a decision maker, and these kind of models often provide an incomplete order of the options of choices. This means that sometimes they provide a ranking in which you may not be able to distinguish different alternatives. Sortings according to the relationship of reference on which the model is based, we can produce a full order, A larger than B, but is larger than C, but is larger than D, or an incomplete order, A and B are larger than C and D, or only an indication of the best option of choices, A is better than all the other choices, the exclusion of certain alternatives, for example, alternative C is excluded due to the fact that, for example, there is a threshold provided by standards of law that is not acceptable, or a simple representation of alternative without the expression of any opinion of merit. So in this case, the decision will be very difficult to be justified. Then there are the ambits of application of a decision. A decisor may work in certainty condition, in which we have transitiveness, and in which we have we do not have stochasticity or randomness and so on. Or we may work deciding risk conditions, in which we may include probabilities for describing the different alternatives, or in the worst case, the decision may be made in uncertainty conditions. Again, I recall you that deciding from a decision theory point of view means linking different alternatives to the possible consequences by employing relationships of merit. In certainty condition, a decision under certainty condition implies that the choice of an alternative involves only one specific consequence. So there is a kind of univoc correspondence between the alternatives and the consequences, such that choosing an alternative automatically implying choosing the consequence, the related consequence. The preferences of a decision maker are simulated generally by single attributes or sometimes by multi-attributes. These are studied through simple function, typically optimization, or value function like minimizing the cost or maximizing the time, or various utility function. We will see some example of that later. And then the sorting of consequences and therefore of the alternative in a ranking of merit. In certainty condition, generally the decision maker is happy because he obtained a complete ranking in a structured certainty decision problem. In risk conditions, instead, each alternative may have several possible consequences, so there is not this univocal correspondence between alternative and consequences, whose probability of occurrence is a priori unknown Its alternative is when associated with a probability distribution, but become in reality the object of choice. So the choice here concerns choosing different probability distribution. The preferences of a decision maker simulated by single attributes or multiple attributes again. It is studied through function of expected values or expected utility, the sorting of consequences, and the form of the alternative in a ranking of expectations of merit. So it is not a complete sorting. In uncertainty condition, instead, its alternative may have different consequences whose probability distribution of occurrence is a priori unknown. So it is treated with highly heterogeneous techniques, including subjective estimates, estimated probabilities, expert opinions, but also in decision theory, we have also game theory, but is one of the branches of decision theory, with but provides some series of mathematical tools, for example, the minimax methodologies and so on, that allows us to sort and rank with different alternatives. As the model for decision making tends to risk and uncertainty, it decreases the system reliability and increases the uncertainty of available information on the relationships and consequences of your decision. In most cases, we are in a position halfway between uncertainty and risk. This means that we are seldom in certainty condition. Instead, the decision maker in environmental impact issues or environmental impact assessment issues is in an uncertainty, is halfway between risk, in which we evaluate consequences in the risk analysis, and uncertainty, in which we do not, or we give up pretending to have a certain complete knowledge of a situation. What happens in environmental impact assessment or even strategic environmental assessment? In certainty condition, there is no decision, but only the calculation of impacts and comparison. As I told you, I anticipated we are very seldom in certainty condition. In risk condition, I apply the calculation of probability, but I have to take into account of different perception of a given probability. Different person may be more or less prone to risk. So the perception of risk depends, is highly subjective. In uncertainty condition, we seek institutional expert and seldom, unfortunately, we use methods such as game theory, minimax, and so on. In practice, in uncertainty condition, we resort to expert knowledge. So this is why in uncertain condition, typically the decision maker or the policy maker build up panels of experts with interacts and discuss and provides possible solutions for the decision, for making the decision. For example, this is the case in a PPC when we need the BREF, best available techniques reference document, and you may recall that these documents are generally drafted by panels of experts in several subjects that gather together, in particular in the IPPC Commission in Sevilla, and produce or write the draft of these reference documents. So in real cases, I find myself having to face a risk situation with elements of uncertainty that are more or less pronounced. So it's always better to work with a multidisciplinary group of experts and involving local communities as much as possible. This means building panels and convening conferences of services that involve all the subjects that may be more or less involved in the decision. So let's finish this lecture by introducing some models for the management and evaluation of environmental policy. We already seen a conceptual model, but is a model for classifying environmental indicators, the so-called DPSIR schema, driver, pressure, state, impact, response. And this model contains both environmental and socio-economic aspects. So this model, this conceptual model, includes all aspects that are of environmental nature, for example, environmental risk or biodiversity, or risk of pollution, of risk of habitat loss, and so on, but also socioeconomic aspects. So in the DPSIR schema, you include also aspects related to the efficiency of a human community system in terms of economical benefits. Environmental indicators are parameters or species, chemical, physical, biological species, with a close relationship with environmental phenomenon that can provide information on the characteristics of the event in its entirety, although it represents only a part. In your career of environmental engineer, you may have seen several examples of these environmental indicators. For example, in ecotoxicology, you may recall that there are some organisms that are employed as environmental indicators in order to evaluate if there is a risk of any kind of ecotoxicological impact. The criteria of choices of the selection and use of a particular indicator is closely linked to the objective which is to be achieved. The OECD identifies two main purposes: to reduce the number of measurements and parameters that are normally required to provide a significant picture of a problem, and to simplify the process of communication through which the results of investigation are provided and disseminated. This is the main objectives of the DPSIR schema that I recall you, that is a classification of a way of classifying environmental indicators. So the model is made up of driving forces, pressure, states, impacts, responses, and was firstly introduced in 1995 in Europe by the European Environmental Agency, in particular the think tank of the OECD. So indicators, drivers are indicators of primary causes, driving forces of environmental change. For example, I need to produce food. Pressure indicators, pressure are indicators of environmental pressures, like, for example, I need to produce food, so I need to do agriculture, so I have nutrient loss due to my agricultural activity. Status are status indicators, state of environment, for example, concentration of nutrients in the water column. Impacts are indicator of impacts, so impacts on population, economy, ecosystem. They often referred to as well-being, so impacts on the well-being of a population, and response, indicator of response, typically are policy maker response, but given by the society. And we have already seen this schema, that is a cyclic schema, which we start by identifying the driving forces, the need of something, generate pressures that may be influence or modify the state of environment, generating impacts, so changing in a drastic way the state of environment. And then these impacts may stimulate or ask for responses, and then the responses may act on a different level or on the driving forces or on the pressure. This is a typical case of common agricultural practice, in which the response is to put limit on the employ of fertilizer and manure in the agricultural activity in order to lower the pressures, and so on. The response may be also on the state directly. This means changing the condition, the status of ecosystem. Of course, this is very difficult because it can be done on very limited and bounded ecosystem, cannot be done on large landscape ecosystem. Of course, we cannot figure out to change the state of a large ecosystem. Okay, primary causes of indicator, economic sectors and human activity, but cause environmental pressure, trend of population, for example, urban environment, energy consumption, again for human environment, urbanized area, that is paved area, tourism pressure, the all urban environment, or companies at risk of major accidents, which may have natural and technological hazards, or electric lines, natural and technological hazards as well. Environmental pressure indicator of the various human activities are major sources of pressure on the various environmental media, for example, emissions of carbon dioxide, production of special wastes, urban network losses, and so on. State indicator of the quality of the current environmental and its alteration, for example, zone levels, number of animals, biodiversity, or heavy content in topsoils, and so on. These are all indicators of states. Indicators of impacts refer to well-being of population, describe the effects on the ecosystem and human health arising from environmental pressures. So, for example, a population exposed to noise is an example in urban environment, or accident scenarios, natural and technological hazards. Response indicators refer to measures taken by the society in order to improve the environment. So, responses provided by the policymaker may be differentiated collection of waste, maybe a response, or public treatment plants of water, maybe another response, what it may be called diffuse treatment of water, acoustic zoning, like in urban environment, and so on. It is important also for impact definition to define impact scales. Impacts may have nominal scales, so the nominal scale, the measured characteristics are mutable quantities with qualitative models, but do not have a necessary order and are therefore subject only to classification. For example, you may subdivide into herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores. Typically in biology, you employ nominal scales linked to the classification in different classes. So you use the name of the classes to build the nominal scale. The scale may be ordinal. The measure features are arranged in a linear sequence that give a sense of magnitude to the inequalities, but does not express the relative values of the intervals. For example, small animals, large animals, medium animals, and so on. Or you may employ cardinal scales in which the measured features are arranged according to a continuous sequence in which are always known the relative distances between the models, so between the modes. For example, the number of animals. Okay, scenarios are the outcome of your model. So scenarios are forecasts concerning the evolution of the actual environment. A conceptual model is based on the analysis of scenarios, a procedure based on the development of environmental scenarios, a comparison of scenarios results, and an evaluation of their consequences. The goal of environmental scenario analysis is to anticipate future developments of nature and society and to evaluate strategies for responding to these developments. A key idea is to explore alternative future developments linked to possible different futures or possible different scenarios. Scenarios are plausible description of how the future may look like. based on a current and internally consistent set of assumptions about key relationships and driving forces, example, the rate of technology changes, the prices changes, and so on. Note what scenarios are neither prediction nor forecast, a simple description of possible future. Scenarios may be subdivided into forecasting or backcasting, meaning that you're looking to the future, or you may look to what may have been the past but brought us to a present situation. So we are looking forward or backward. And scenarios may be simply qualitative. In this case, they are called storylines. Qualitative scenarios describe possible futures in the form of words and visual symbols rather than numerical estimates. They can take the shape of diagrams, phrases, or outlines, but more commonly they are made up of narrative text, the so-called storylines. Okay, I'm not going to the details about scenarios. We stop here and we shall continue on Thursday by going to the father of all of the decision support system, a more general model decision support system, that is called the multi-criteria analysis model. Okay, for now I stop here. If you have any question, I'm here. I'm ready to answer your questions.